Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to have lots of tips on how to paint white fur or white hair in acrylics. Now before I get started with that, the first thing I always begin with once I've done the background is the eye. Now for the eye, I'm just simply starting off here with black and a small round brush to map in the outside shape of the eye. This is my priority, just to make sure that I've got those proportions accurate. This is where the main expression stems from, so I do really want to make sure that I've got that accurate. Now when I first start blocking in my base foundation, this would be the same if I was working on the face. I just want to make sure I've got that background covered. So in this instance, for that first layer, I don't want to add too much water because that will naturally make that mixture more thin, more transparent, and then it's going to show more of that background through it. Once I've covered that up, that's when I can really start to establish any subtle reflections or highlights and then building up my values in stages. Now the wonderful thing about working with acrylics is we do have that flexibility that we can add even the brightest highlight on top of a very dark layer. So maximising that contrast there is going to be a priority with any painting that I'm creating. Now once I was happy with the base foundation, this is where I can start to consider more of those finer top layers of detail. So this would be the eyelashes and those finer little creases around the eye and on the eyelid. Now a big tip, when painting these little creases here, I want to be making sure that they're not too harsh and that the edges do have a slight degree of softness to them. If those lines are too harsh, you can actually change the expression almost to make it look like there's more of an angry look to the horse around that eye, more of a tense look there. So that is something that I do want to consider, especially when the horse, such as this, had a very kind, soft look to the face. Now when I started working on the face, this is where I was focusing more on how to capture that white fur look but still make sure that I had all of the key midtones, the variation in those values that makes this look realistic. Now my first tip, and this would be the same with any fur colour, is to make sure that the base foundation is blended and it has those softer edges. So although this is not really blurry like the background, there are no harsh start and stop points between my lights and my darks. I think this makes a massive difference in how realistic the details look on top. Now what is important with working with this approach is that the highlights and shadows still need to be in the right place. Just like the fur direction, the placement of the lights and darks are following the structures under the skin. So here at the top of the eye where it is generally lighter, that's showing where the top of the eye socket is. Where we've got that slightly darker curve just above the nose band, that's where the cheekbone is of the horse. All of these key light and dark areas need to be accurate in order to build up the right shape and form, which of course is very unique to each individual animal. Now my next tip for painting white hair is to make sure that the base layer underneath isn't too dark. Now the reason I say that is because it can actually extend that painting process and give us too much contrast. This isn't something that I often mention because contrast is good. We want to have that sharp difference between the lights and the darks. But here you can see that although there are slight darker values on the face, there is nothing that's as dark as the eye. As I'm coming back in with my brush here and just building up that initial hair direction and texture, I'm always building up my layers in stages. So I might add just a little bit more titanium white in this instance to mean then that I can hint at more of my highlights, but that they are very, very subtle. And if I started with a darker base foundation, these highlights early on would still look much brighter because what's next to it is darker. Now in some situations that's what we want. So let's say for example I've got a really bright highlight in the eye, but it doesn't look as bright as I want it to. But I physically used my brightest paint, in this case the titanium white again. But if I wanted that to appear brighter, it would be an indication that what's next to it isn't dark enough. So it may be that the iris colour needs to be darkened, the part of the eyelid around the eye needs to be darker. By doing that, it will automatically make that light highlight appear brighter. Now one thing I want to mention here just about these tiny little brown little flecks in the hair, if they were any larger then I'd be trying to incorporate those in more of my mid layers, but because they were so small I've added them over the top, but I've still made sure to focus on just slightly softening the outer edges so that they didn't look like polka dots. Now, of course, all of this is covered more thoroughly in that real-time version of this tutorial. I record all of those lessons with a voiceover while I'm painting, so everything is explained in the moment, and it makes even the more complex subjects more step by step. If they are of interest, then I'll link my real-time tutorials in the description below. Now for the ears and the forelock, this is something where I feel again the level of softness for the base foundation is crucial. You can see here that I'm working with more generous layers of paint. I don't want to be working with such thin layers that as I'm starting to blend that, I'm still exposing more of that background colour. I have to make sure that that covers completely, and then I can start building in more definition. Now to build in the detail, same concept applies. I'm working with lots of subtle layers. So you can see here that I've incorporated more of a grey tone. I've put a little bit of brown in there just to make it slightly warmer, but I'm not jumping into my brightest highlights first. I want to always be paying attention to what element is in front. So in this situation, the forelock is behind the left ear as you look at the painting, but it's in front of the right ear. So where I'm working with my layers now, I'm going to be paying attention to those differences, and if I need to add details over another area, potentially I might need to come back and add those details later. For example, if I tried adding in those finer details for the left ear and they overlapped the side of the forelock, if the forelock isn't finished, then those details are going to be potentially painted over. It's just one of those things that would actually waste a bit of time. So if there are any details that overlap anything else that isn't finished, it's always worthwhile just to wait on those for a moment, work on what's next to it, and then come back to it. Now in a moment here, I'm going to use a brown glaze to adjust the inner ear colour. For 99% of my paintings, I would use more glazes than I have in this situation, but that is going to vary depending on each reference photo. This horse was generally quite a bit lighter, and I have incorporated more of my purples within each of the layers that I'm working with because I have adjusted my background. Now I will have the background of this painting in a separate video here on YouTube, but if you would like to see all of that as well, then of course that is included in the real-time lesson. Now glazes are a wonderful way of working with acrylics because as I'm doing here, I can focus on building up my layers and just look at the contrast, really emphasising those lights and darks and the details. Once I've got those in place, I can then work with a glaze to adjust the colour of the fur. We don't have to be mixing our paint, getting the lights and the darks right and the colour, thinking about how much paint to get on our brush, how to load it onto the canvas, then blending and so on. We can break this up into more manageable sections just by using glazes. Now I do have a video here on YouTube where I'm showing different paintings for various scenarios and how glazing can be effective. If that's of interest, I will link that video in the description below. One tip, and I do mention this in that video, is working with a glaze. It's very, very important that the layers of paint underneath are entirely dry. If not, that glaze will mix in with that wet paint and then it will just cause more of a foggy mess. It's just something that's going to cause a lot more problems and the glaze won't be effective at all. So you do want to make sure that that painting is dry before coming back in with a glaze. And it just has to be that one section where the glaze is being applied. Now when painting any horse nose or muzzle like this, the techniques are pretty much the same for painting skin. I want to be making sure that I don't have any harsh start and stop points, and of course I've mentioned that when working on the hair or fur for the base layer. But this is really important because if there are too many harsh edges, it will make the skin look more wrinkled potentially. It could have far more of a textured look, and this definitely has a very soft, smooth appearance to it. So making sure there is a softness between the brushstrokes with the lights and the darks is definitely going to have more of that realistic look for the desired effect that I'm wanting here. Now once I've got more of my base established and I'm clearly hinting at more of that shape and form, I want to also be paying attention to any of the smaller little pigmentation spots. This would be the same if the dog maybe I was painting was panting and it had some of those darker spots on the tongue. A Dalmatian, for example, anything here where it's got those light and dark patches, I do want to make sure they are in the right place, they are the right value, so they're not too dark, but they're not too light, and that there's not a harsh separation between the two. Now what I mean by that is that it's not a really super crisp edge like on the background and the very edge of the lower lip. That there, I want there to be a harsh edge because it's a completely different, separate part of the painting. Whereas here, where I'm starting to build up those tiny little dots, you can see that there is a very slight degree of transition where that paint just mixes a little bit, but there is still a boundary between the two. If I overly blended that area there, it's going to look more like a blue shadow rather than a section of pigmented skin. Once I'd got that in place, you can see then that I came back in with my smaller round brushes and hinted more at the little dots to work with more of those smaller pigment patches. This is another aspect that's very unique to each individual animal, so I don't want to be adding more or less of those, and I do want to make sure that they are in the right place. This horse obviously has a lot of tiny little spots, so I'm not going to the extreme in this situation, making sure that every single one of those is millimetre perfect, but I do want to make sure that they are in about the right location. If I was painting a Dalmatian, I certainly don't want to be adding random spots where they shouldn't be because they are much larger. The owner of that dog is going to know if there's more markings than there should be. But for something like this, where the little dots, there are so many of them and they're very close together, as long as I've got it close, I feel that that is good enough here. And of course, if I'm working on a much larger painting, 16 by 24 for example, even bigger than that, I've got more space to get even more of those dots more accurate. When working on smaller paintings, that is something we need to be aware of. I'd much rather focus more on the contrast than forcing in every little dot and then covering up too much of the layer underneath, which can happen very easily when working on smaller paintings. Now another thing here that I think is really important is to leave the whiskers until the very last layer, just in case there's any alterations that need to be made to this part of the painting. I'm not then committed to working in between those fine lines, so it is something that I always do leave until the very end. Now the next part of this painting and the bridle really helped to enhance the level of contrast. Because everything so far on the horse has been pretty bright, this darker value up against it is what helps to make that harsh contrast make everything else look realistic. This automatically, as I've mentioned before, will make the horse look lighter because we're incorporating more of those darker elements next to it. Now my biggest tip when painting leather is to make sure that the lights and darks are accurate. So there is also a degree of blending here. The lighter highlights are going to gradually transition into a shadow, and that could be where the forelock is sitting over the top. It may be where the strap has a bit of a curve to it. All of that there needs to have that smoother blending in order to replicate that flatter but slightly shinier surface. The other thing that makes something look more shiny is high contrast. So the buckle here, where I want to have more of that metal look, bright highlights and dark shadows is the best way to achieve that. Now this bridle is very small in relation to the size of the painting, so I do need to be realistic with what I can include in terms of the level of detail. But this bridle, when finished, will still look realistic because I've made sure to focus on those values and contrast. Now throughout this entire painting, even the larger areas, you'll see that I do prefer to use my smaller sized brushes. I just find that the larger brushes I'm more likely to skip through important light and dark changes. And again, like what I mentioned at the beginning of this video, it's those that help to replicate that shape and form. So if I can make sure as much as I can that all of the relevant changes are in place, those smaller brushes I feel allow that more easily. Here's a great example where I'm putting in that finer edging to the bridle strap. This is going to be far harder if I'm working with a larger brush. It may get that paint application in quicker, but if I'm covering up more of those important layers, then I'm going to have to spend time fixing that. So my preference in this situation is just to spend more time with those smaller brushes and getting it more accurate from that very first base foundation. Now this area in particular is a great example of that. You'll see that with that small brush, I've just hinted with black paint where the darkest shadows are in between each of those segments. This then means that I can break each part up into those very, very tiny areas, and by the time this whole section has been completed, it's going to look more like that reference photo. Rather than trying to block this in all in one colour and then trying to make sense of the shapes, It's far easier to just work on 1 centimetre at a time if needed. Now, it's always my preference to break it up into small sections rather than whole individual layers, but that's just because I prefer to work that way. I do feel that if I block in the base layer for the entire horse, then I do my second layer and my third layer and so on, that I know that I'm more likely to rush through those layers. And because the layers of subtlety here and building up everything in stages I feel is so important, it's one of the reasons I just don't like working that way. Now, of course, that being said, if you do prefer that, then that is, there's no right or wrong way of working. But if you do feel like you're getting overwhelmed within that layering process, it may likely be that that area of the painting is just too big. So scaling that down 1 inch at a time if needed can have a real difference in how effective we are with that painting process. Now, this bridle in this painting did have more of a simplistic look to it. There wasn't a huge amount of stitching. The straps just looked a bit more flatter in general. Now, that being said, as you can see here, I'm still making sure to capture that value and contrast the way that the light is hitting the leather. Now, if I was working with a photo where that bridle had lots more stitching, it maybe had a bit more texture to it, that is something that I am going to spend that time to get right. It would be a real shame if the level of realism in the horse was something that we were super proud of, but the bridle looked unfinished because it lacked that same degree of depth. So each strap does need to be given the right amount of time, but with a reference photo where it's sharp and high quality, like the one that I was working from here, if there isn't that detail that I can see, I don't want to force it. Now, the bit of the bridle, again, this is with the whole metal concept. I want to be making sure that I've got high contrast, but my first priority, as always, is getting a blended layer. There's no harsh start and stop points at this stage. I want to be making sure that I've got that degree of softness. I do just feel that it helps with the detailing. Now, once I've achieved that, this is where I can refine the contrast, so I can darken my shadows and begin adding my highlights. Now, one big tip when painting metal is it is very reflective because of that shiny surface. So once I've established my lights and my darks, I will wait for this to dry and then I apply a purple glaze. Now, the reason that I add this slight glaze here is because I've changed the background in the original reference photo. I wanted some of that bluebell colour to look like it was being reflected up into the shiny parts of this painting. Now, if the background was a sunset sky and there was more oranges and yellows there, then I would use those colours in that metal to aid with that level of reflection. So this is something that does need to be adjusted. And of course, if you're working from the original reference photo of any painting and you haven't changed the background, then you won't need to incorporate more of those colours. It is something that needs to be adjusted depending on that painting situation. Now, for the final part where I'm blocking in the neck and the cheek, this is where I'm breaking that rule of mine where I'm working on a bit more of a larger area. The reason I've done that here is all of these colours underneath the mane and the neck area and the side of the cheek were very similar. So rather than working just on the cheek area, that smaller section, and then my paint drying on my palette, I decided to just keep going with this area, make use of that paint because I was really happy with the colours that I'd mixed, and then work with my base foundation for the neck as well. Now, because of the way that the head of this horse is turned slightly, there's not any real harsh start and stop points between the mane and the neck. The mane is the same colour as well, so there's no darker portions here that I needed to worry about. Being able to capture that level of softness in the mane is going to be much easier if the area of the neck at the base and the mane are blended, which, as you can see, I'm starting to establish here. I'm only focusing on that light source where the main lights and darks are, but as always, it's blended. There's no harsh start and stop points, and this is certainly going to make it much easier when we start painting the details on the mane. Now, something I want to mention about that just briefly is if the mane of the horse was a much darker colour, but the neck was a lighter colour, I would still blend the two different colours together at that edge where it overlaps. So you would want a darker colour at the top, a lighter colour at the bottom, but still indicate roughly where that mane and the longer hair would finish. If it's got some of that neck colour underneath showing through, that's at that point where you want to blend. because it is going to make it much easier for those longer details to be added on top, which of course I'm going to demonstrate in the next couple of minutes. Now on this part here, you can see that I'm starting to add some lighter details, but they're not really showing up. What happens here is if the layers underneath are too light, the lighter details that we add on top are not going to be able to show up. The values are too similar. So what I'm having to do here is come back in with a slightly darker grey, add a little bit more contrast, and then come back in with my highlights. And this is something that's really worth paying attention to with any animal. It doesn't matter the colour of the fur. If your highlights aren't showing up, that is an indication that what's underneath it isn't dark enough. Taking that time to adjust that can make a massive difference to how those details look. And again, going back to what I've mentioned with glazes, it doesn't mean that you have to paint over the entire section. You could just add a slightly darker glaze, allow those layers to still show through, but just tint it, add a bit more of that darker shadow, and then come back in with those lighter values. Now for this section of where the cheek meets the neck, I'm going to be painting over a lot of this, but I needed to make sure that there were still some of the details showing through, because this is going to still at times be visible in between my longer brush strokes. So something I've already mentioned in this video is paying attention to what is in front and what is behind. This does make the painting process much easier. Now as I start to add a bit more definition to the mane here, you can see why it was so important to get that base layer well blended. You can see the end of these brush strokes, they still look like they're fading out into that slightly darker shadow on the neck. Building this up in stages and always capturing that softness is going to make these long, more wispy details here still have that softness that we want. I don't want to have the mane to look like it's a bit more spaghetti-like. So in some cases, if we create whole long individual brush strokes from the very top of the mane all the way down to the bottom, it does look artificial. It looks like that hair is fake. Whereas coming in and breaking those lines up into 3 or 4 segments, you can see here I'm working at the top, then I do a midsection, then I'll finish that brush stroke off at the ends. By splitting that up, it just means then that there's no one continuous solid brush stroke from the top all the way to the tip of that hair. Because if I was to look at this horse in person, and even that reference photo, you can't actually isolate each individual hair on the mane. There are so many hairs there that it's all intertwined, all of the hairs are mixed with different layers. It's something where we shouldn't be able to pinpoint specific details from start to finish. So I actually lift up my brush, start that brush stroke again, but there is always that period where I'm taking the brush away. It just prevents that habit from creating one solid brush stroke from that top edge all the way to the finer tip. Now the pressure on the brush with these kinds of details is really important. Too much pressure and those brush strokes are going to be really thick. Now I do have a video here on YouTube where I've got lots of tips on how to use a liner or a rigger brush for these kinds of fine lines. I will link that in the description as well if it's of interest. Now one quick thing I do want to mention, where I've zoomed out here, it makes it look like the darker values have lost some of that rich darkness to it. All of that is going to return once the painting is varnished. Because the paints have a bit more of a matte finish to them, it can make it look like it's faded slightly. It's not what's happened, it's just that the paint has dried. So as soon as a gloss varnish, which is my preference, is applied over the top, this paint is all going to look how it did when it was wet. It's going to have that beautiful contrast and lovely colour saturation. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I do also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to paint along to the real-time version of this tutorial, then as I've mentioned, all of the information to that is listed in the description below. If you've got any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.